Welcome to Disciple Dojo. We're continuing our walk through the lyrics of the Psalms. Today we're going to be looking at Psalm 17. Now there's a pretty good bit to cover in this song. It's a little bit longer than the last one, so I'm actually not going to read it from my old NIV study Bible like we normally do. We're just going to jump right into the text, look at as much as possible the original language, but also compare some different translations, because there are a couple of verses in this psalm that you're going to get major differences among the translations because the Hebrew text is just not very clear. And so before we jump in, just as a reminder, if you appreciate this video and you want to see the other episodes in this playlist, you can find those in the video description below. And if you haven't already, we would love for you to subscribe to this channel. So with that out of the way, let's look at Psalm 17. As usual, I have my very, very literal, woodenly literal translation here on the screen. And it begins, a prayer for David. And so when we're reading the Psalms, again, we are reading prayers. We are reading the language that Israel used, that God inspired the authors to give Israel to use in their communication with him. The Psalms, again, they give us a vocabulary for our spirituality and our outlook on the world and on God and on our relationship with both. So this Davidic prayer begins, Shema Adonai Tzedek, literally hear or listen. This is like the imperative, but there's this fancy Hebrew word, paragogic hey, on the end of the word, and it's like either for emphasis or possibly for some type of like entreaty. It's crying out to God, listen, hear Yahweh, the covenant name of God. That's who's being addressed. Yahweh, hear Tzedek. Now, tzedek is the normal word for righteousness, and this is an indefinite, so it's just a righteousness. But in the context of someone hearing, particularly like a priest or a judge, going before someone to hear righteousness and then for them to issue justice or to say what is right, that is the language of vindication in a courtroom setting. And so different translations handle it differently. The JPS says, hear the right, O Lord. The NJPS, the Tanakh, hear, O Lord, what is just. Lexham English, O Yahweh, hear a just cause. NIV interprets it a little bit. Hear me, Lord, my plea is just. All of the modern standard translations, RSV, NRSV, ESV, New American Standard, Holman Christian Standard, they all have it as just cause. And Eugene Peterson brings out the kind of judicial setting of this, saying, listen while I build my case, God. So it's literally the word for righteousness, but righteousness in English, it's become a churchy word. It means, righteous, like not sinning and living an upright life. But this was also the language that you would use when you pled your case before someone who was going to issue a verdict. So I've just translated it as, hear please, Yahweh, vindication. The next line, Hakshiva rinati, listen, pay attention, listen attentively to my rina, my cry for help, my plea for help. Ha'azina tafili, give ear, literally give ear or put ear, bend your ear toward my prayer, my tefillah. So hear, listen, give ear to, three ways of saying the same thing. My vindication or my just plea, my cry, my prayer. So this is a good Hebrew poetic repetition, 3 times saying something in 3 slightly different ways. And then he qualifies what type of prayer, what type of rina, what type of tzedek, just cause, is one, and this is awkwardly phrased, below shiftei mirma, in not lips of fraud or deceit. This is swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. And then this kind of courtroom language continues in verse 2, literally from your face or from your presence or from before you. Mishpati, my justice. And mishpat is the word for justice, and it's also the word for like a just verdict. Declaring someone tzedek, declaring them righteous or in the right, is issuing mishpat. It's bringing about a judgment. It's rendering justice. And so the psalmist is bringing their case before the Lord, saying, from before you, from your presence, my justice goes forth, goes out. The verdict is given and the verdict goes out to everyone. And why does he have confidence in this? Because your eyes, Chaza, your eyes see, they look at, they gaze at, mesharim, literally upright things or uprights. It's a plural, but I think this word is almost always found in the plural, and it's just like categorical plural. It just means what is upright. So this is the confidence that the psalmist has, is taking his case before the one whose eyes see what is upright. And he knows that God knows that he's saying what's right, because verse 3, Bachanta Levi, you tested my heart. Pachadta Laila, you inspected Laila by night. This should bring to mind what we saw in the last Psalm, Psalm 16, when it talked about by night my kidneys instruct me. And we talked about how kidneys was like how we would use the word your guts or your heart or your inward self. Saraftani, literally you refined me, but it means to burn with fire or to like refine in the sense of metallurgy. You've tried me by fire. Baal timtza, literally not you found, and we would say you found nothing. So God knows, and the psalmist knows, that this is a just and a righteous cry for help, for justice. They are in the right. And just as he emphasizes in verse 1 that his lips are not lips of deceit, at the end of verse 3, he reemphasizes it. He says, zamoti, and this is from the verb zamam. Zamam has two meanings, so it depends on which way you take this. I'll open up Halet, Hebrew Aramaic Lexicon of the Old Testament here, and you can see this verb zamam, and the first meaning is like to murmur, which then means to ponder or to plan. So it's like to have something in mind, to intend. But there's another zamam, and that is the word that means to muzzle. So zamoti can either be translated as I planned, like I intended, or it can be I muzzled. And one of the reasons that muzzled, even though it's a far less common meaning of the term, one of the reasons that it might contextually make more sense is because the next phrase, Baal Ya'avar Pi. So this literally is not, it will transgress my mouth. So this can either be saying, I intentionally, I planned, I made sure that my mouth did not transgress. My mouth spoke not in deceit. Or it could say, I muzzled so that my mouth would not transgress. In other words, I kept my mouth quiet lest even my words not be upright. And that then would spill into the next verse, verse 4, which is also hard to translate because it's awkward Hebrew, but it literally says, for works of or deeds of Adam, humanity or human, literally in a word or against a word of your lips. So the way I tend to interpret this is the psalmist is saying, God, you've tested me, you've refined me, you know I'm being truthful. And the reason he has such confidence in his truthfulness is because he planned, or you could even say he muzzled, whichever meaning works, that his mouth would not transgress in the way that human deeds, human doings, worldly actions go against the lips of God, which is a way of poetically talking about God's word, the words that come from the mouth of God. So in contrast to humanity, whose deeds go against the words of your mouth, I have planned, or maybe even muzzled, my mouth so as not to transgress. And that's what the psalmist is saying that God knows, because God has tried him and tested him. And if my reading is correct, then the middle of verse 4 would kind of be a change in subject, or like maybe a slight break here. So instead of verse 4 all being one thought, which is how the Masoretic text has it pointed and which is how a lot of translations handle it, I think it's possible that verse 4 should be split, and that the next part of verse 4 goes into the next part of what's going to happen in the psalm, because the next part says literally, verse 4b, Ani shamarti, I myself. Ani is the emphatic. I, and then shamarti, I have guarded. I myself have guarded. And in this case, contextually, we'd say guarded against. Archoth paritz, paths violent. So violent paths, the way of violence. I have guarded myself against the way of violence. Tamok ashurai, literally to hold my footsteps. Bama'agoloteka, upon your paths. So this would all be one thought. I guarded myself from going the way of the violent in order to hold my footsteps upon your paths. Kind of tracing up all the way back to Psalm 1, the very first psalm that talked about the two ways you can go, the path of the righteous or the path of the wicked. So this may be a callback to that. And then finishing out verse 5, Baal namotu, literally not, they will totter, or they will, and I think this is a passive, they will be shaken, tottered, toppled, pa'amai, my steps. So these three lines, I think, fit together nicely if we put the first part of verse 4 with verse 3, what came before it. Summarizing it, God knows that the psalmist is speaking truth because the psalmist planned and made sure that his mouth would not transgress, in contrast to the works of humanity, which are against the words of God's lips. And not just speaking what is right, but the psalmist also made sure that he did what is right. He guarded himself against going the way of violence. He held his steps to the path of God, and because of that, his feet won't be shaken. So that's how I read this section of the psalm, but that's certainly not the only way. And let's look at a couple of other translations just so you can get a feel for how different translators have rendered these lines in English. Most of the translations keep the verses separate, verses 3, verses 4, and verses 5, whereas in my reading of it, verse 4, you should split it in the middle, and the first half should go with verse 3, second half should go with verse 5. But here are the other options. Lexham English, you have tried my heart, you have examined me by night, you've tested me, you found nothing. I have decided that my mouth will not transgress. End of the verse. As for works of humankind, by the word of your lips I have kept from the ways of the violent. I have held my steps in your path, my feet will not slip. The NIV, though people tried to bribe me, I have kept myself from the ways of the violent through what your lips have commanded. My steps have held to your paths, my feet have not stumbled. So this is rendering out not only in past tense, whereas this one was in future tense, but also interpreting that phrase, the works of humankind, as though people tried to bribe me. And I'm honestly not sure how the NIV gets this translation. King James, concerning the works of men, by the word of thy lips, I have kept me from the paths of the destroyer. Hold up my goings in thy paths, that my footsteps slip not. So Lexham has it as a future tense, NIV has it as a past tense, King James has it, something the psalmist is asking God to do. The Tanakh, as for man's dealings, in accord with the command of your lips, I have kept in view the fate of the lawless. My feet have held to your paths. My legs have not given way. So this is translating this shamarti, I have guarded, as I have kept in view. And then the paths of the violent, they're translating it as the fate, like your path in life. Now, at this point, it would be nice if we could see what the Dead Sea Scroll has, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, this section of the Psalms is missing. But the Septuagint translates it as, in order that my mouth would not speak the works of humans because of the words of your lips, I guarded against stubborn ways. And then there's the plea, establish my steps in your paths, so my steps are not shaken. The New American Standard has, as for the works of mankind, by the word of your lips I have kept from the ways of the violent. My steps have held to your paths, my feet have not slipped. And that's pretty much how all the modern standard translations render it. Now, Eugene Peterson, of course, paraphrases this, trying to keep some of the poetry while greatly simplifying it. And he says it this way: I'm not trying to get my way in the world's way. I'm trying to get your way, your word's way. I'm staying on your trail. I'm putting one foot in front of the other. I'm not giving up. So very much a paraphrase, not really at all a translation, but it does communicate what the standard translations are trying to say. What it really comes down to is what you do with this phrase, this literally, for deeds of humanity in word of your lips. You translate as by the words of your lips, or what I think contextually is more likely against the words of your lips. I could be wrong. I'm not a Hebrew linguist, so I may very well be missing some particular point of Hebrew syntax or Hebrew grammar that makes how I'm rendering this implausible. And if that's so, if you're a Dojo viewer who has working knowledge of biblical Hebrew, I would love to hear what you think about this rendering of Psalm 17:4 and whether this should go with verse 3 or whether all of verse 4 is giving one thought that flows smoothly. Either way, whichever way you take this, we end up in the same place in verse 6, re-emphasizing how the psalm began. Because of all of this, Ani Kurathicha, I myself call to you. Ki ta'aneni el, for you will answer me. God, and this is the word el, this is the generic word for God. Hat azancha li. This is from the verb nata, to stretch out. Stretch out your ear to me, God. Listen, I'm crying out to you. I'm coming before you with this prayer. Stretch your ear out to me. Shema imrati. And this is the shortened imperative form of the verb that the psalm began with. This time there's no paragogical hey on the end. It's just Shema imarti. Listen to my utterance, to my speech. So now we're seeing what the psalmist is asking God to do, what his tzedek consists of. And in verse 7, he's going to make some callbacks to some pretty significant biblical language. These are loaded terms kind of clustered around the Exodus event, and particularly after the crossing of the Red Sea and the celebratory song in Exodus 15, this vocabulary would have jumped out to the ears of the original hearers. Verse 7, it says, Hafle chasadecha, literally, make wonderful. In its adjectival and noun forms, this word, pella, is the word for wonder or something that's marvelous, miracle. And so this verb is saying, make wonderful, like magnify your covenant faithfulness. And I've left chesed untranslated. Again, in the Psalms, whenever we come across chesed, I always leave it untranslated because there's no English equivalent for it. It's a covenantal term that has to do with like just unwavering, steadfast devotion with elements of mercy, of showing undeserved kindness, loving kindness, steadfast love, faithfulness. That's why it gets translated in all these different ways in English. And so the psalmist is saying, make wonderful your chesed, Moshiach chosim, literally one who is saving. This is where Yeshua, Yasha, to save. We've seen this verb all throughout the Psalms. And this is how the Exodus described what God did for Israel. He saved them. So one saving or savior of Chosim is from Chasa, which we've also seen in previous Psalms of seek refuge in. So this is literally one's seeking refuge, refugees. I love this title. Moshiach Chosim, Savior of Refugees. This should inform how we today think of refugees, by the way. And then clarifying the one seeking refuge, specifically, this is a fun word in Hebrew, mimith komim, literally from one's rebelling. And then this, biminecha, can be translated as against your right hand. And like in Exodus, the right hand of God, that's a figure of speech that's a bit of a parody of the Egyptian context of Pharaoh's strong right arm, and how in Exodus it's Yahweh is the one whose right arm is what saves Israel. But this could be translated as those who are rebelling against your right hand. In other words, those who are rebelling against the arm of the Lord. Or if you translate this as by your right hand, then it's Savior of refugees from the ones rebelling by your right hand. In other words, the by your right hand modifies how God is saving the refugees. He's saving them by his right hand. Either way, you end up with the same overall basic meaning. And this is Exodus language. He is recounting the deeds of God towards his ancestors and saying, because that's the type of God you are, because you've done this before, I am asking you to do this again. And I'm not just asking you to save me, like keep me safe and just kind of give me what I need. He goes on in verse 8 to talk about incredible intimacy. Shamreni, guard me or keep me. This is the word that we saw earlier. I've guarded my steps from the paths of the violent. Now he's asking God to guard him, to keep him, to protect him. And then this phrase, Ka'ishon bat ein, literally like a little man, daughter of an eye. Now, almost every English translation translates this in a way that just gets on my nerves. Even the Lexham English, which is a fairly literal translation, it disappoints me here. It says, keep me as the apple of your eye. NIV, keep me as the apple of your eye. King James, keep me as the apple of the eye. JPS, keep me as the apple of the eye. Tanakh, guard me like the apple of your eye. And the Septuagint has phulaxon me hos horan ophthalmu. Guard me like the horon. And the Lexham English Septuagint even translated it as the apple of your eye. RSV and RSV ESV all have it as keep me as the apple of your eye. But the Greek word horon doesn't mean apple. You can see it here in Logos. The chore is the pupil of your eye. So how did we get from Hebrew, little man, daughter of eye, to Greek, pupil of eye, to English, the apple of your eye? In Gilligam's commentary on the Psalms receptions throughout the history, in commenting on this verse, she talks about how this isn't a Jewish translation. Rashi reads the Hebrew as the pupil of the eye, upon whose soundness sight depends. So our eyelids protect it with utmost care. And the Hebrew, ke'eshon, there's suggestion that it's a diminutive for man. The word for man is ish. Ish is man, ishon is little man. And therefore, it denotes the little image one receives of oneself when looking into the pupil of the eye of another. You look at somebody right in the eye, and right in the middle, in their pupil, what are you going to see? You're going to see yourself looking back at you. You're going to see the ishon, the little man. And so she says, this is perhaps what is intended in the Latin pupilla, literally tiny doll, which Rashi would have known about. So in Latin, the word pupilla, where we get pupil from, is the word for little doll. And she continues, so whence the phrase apple of the eye in English, which seems to have been used as early as King Alfred? Well, here's the answer. It was popularized by Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 3, Scene 2, line 104. Flower of this purple dye, hit with Cupid's archery, sink in apple of his eye. This phrase probably came from the Geneva Bible, or Coverdale's translation of the Psalms. So it was the Geneva Bible that translated Ka'ishon bat ayin, little man, daughter of an eye, with the phrase apple of the eye. And who knows, maybe they were thinking, like apples are little and round, and this is talking about the round part, the pupil of the eye. So it was a very obscure phrase chosen by English translators way, way back. It got picked up and popularized in Midsummer Night's Dream, and now it's in almost every translation. In fact, of all of these modern translations that we're looking at in this study, the only one that doesn't go with apple of the eye is the CSB, and its predecessor, the Holman CSB. Protect me as the pupil of your eye. So why am I spending any amount of time on whether it should be translated apple of the eye or pupil of the eye? Because apple of the eye, we use that phrase as like, oh, you're the apple of my eye, like something that's just delightful, something that you really have your eye on, or something that you really like. But I don't think that makes as much sense as the actual idiom itself. The little man, daughter of the eye, in other words, the little man, daughter, it's just a diminutive way of saying the little thing in the center of the eye. This is a figure of speech referring to what we would call your pupil. If you've ever put in contacts, if you've ever gotten a piece of something in your eye, you know how important it is to guard the pupil of your eye. Without the pupil of your eye is useless. So guard me like the apple of your eye means, guard me like something special. That doesn't have as much emotional pathos to it, at least I don't think it does, as guard me the way you guard the pupil of your eye. Like one of the most delicate and precious parts of your body, that you keep sharp and pointy things and hurty things out of it. Treat me that way. Like, that's the level of intimacy. That's the level of protection that I'm asking for, God. I think it's a much more intimate picture. I think it's just a more powerful image. And I think the familiarity of the phrase apple of the eye actually, in my personal opinion, which is what you're getting on this channel, undermines the severity of what the psalmist is asking God to do. And this poetic intimacy imagery continues in the next part of the line, B'tzel kanafecha, in the shadow of your wing, tastireni. Hide me in the shadow. Like this is, you can't help but hear the image of Jesus when he was lamenting over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, how I long to gather you under my wings as a hen gathers her chicks. This is what the psalmist is asking God to do. Keep me in the shadow of your wing. Now, does this mean that God literally has wings? No more so than God literally has a pupil. This is figurative poetic imagery, but it does have parallel in the ancient world. For instance, here's an Egyptian carving of the god Horus at birth being protected under the wings of these mighty creatures, these divine beings protecting, sheltering under the wing. And speaking of Horus, here's an image of Horus portrayed as a falcon sheltering under his wings, literally sheltering Pharaoh Nectanebo II. So this is literally a pharaoh being sheltered under the wings of his god, of Horus. So when the psalmist is asking God to put him in the shadow of his wing, that's the image that should come to mind, is this divine protection. And what is the psalmist asking this protection from? Verse 9, Mifnei Rashaim, from the face of wicked ones, Zu Shaduni, who devastate me, or who destroy me, or who are trying to destroy me. Oyavai Benefesh, my enemy in soul. We would say my mortal enemy. Like, not just somebody who cuts me off in traffic, my soul's enemy, the enemy of my life, my nefesh. Yakifu alai. They encircle upon me. They surround me. Verse 10 is a very obscure, weird phrase in Hebrew. It literally says, Chel bamo sagru, his fat closed, or closed up, or shut. Pimo, his mouth, divru, spoke, v'reuth, in majesty, or in exaltedness, or we would say in pride. Now, most translations take his fat closed up, fat being like a description or an idiom for someone whose heart has grown calloused, whose heart has closed off. And so you get, like some English, they have shut off their calloused heart, with their mouth they speak arrogantly. And that's NIV. They close up their calloused hearts, their mouths speak with arrogance. King James leaves it. They are enclosed in their own fat, with their mouth they speak proudly. So King James reads it as kind of a passive, not their fat closed or shut, but they are enclosed within their own fat. The old JPS has their gross heart they have shut tight. With their mouth they speak proudly. The updated Tanakh, their hearts are closed to pity. They mouth arrogance. The Septuagint, they enclose themselves with their stiff fat. Their mouth spoke arrogance. New American, they have closed their unfeeling hearts. With their mouths they speak proudly. And then Holman Christian had, they have become hardened. And then the CSB updated that to, they are uncaring. So other than maybe the King James, most translations are seeing that this, his fat closed up, as an idiom, a figure of speech, meaning closed his heart. Some have suggested that it means more like fat is a figure of speech in scripture for opulence or greed or gluttony. And so some have suggested that that's what it means, his fat closed up, meaning they've gotten so fat. Like I think one translation in a commentary I saw said something like their throat became engorged, or their fat closed off their throat. Like they got so fat they couldn't even eat anymore. It's just this extreme picture of just rampant obesity as an image for material wealth. So however you take that, it's an odd figure of speech, but the idea is these enemies, those who are rebelling against God and from whom people are seeking refuge, including the psalmist, are those who are so haughty and arrogant and just gorged on this life. And verse 11 continues this imagery of these people as predatory and just seeking to devour. There's question about how the first word should be translated. Asherenu ata savavuni. Literally, if you took the Hebrew Masoretic text literally, it would say, our footsteps, now he surrounds me. That doesn't make sense. That's just weird Hebrew. And even the Masoretes thought this. The Masoretes had a Kethiv Kareh reading. The Kethiv, that's what's written, but the Kareh should be read, the Masorete scribes are saying it should be read as surround us. And the Septuagint translated Asherenu not as our footsteps, but as ekbalontes me, the ones casting me out. So verse 11 is difficult in both Hebrew and Greek. And the difficulty continues in the next line. Enehem, literally their eyes, yashitu, they set or they put, so they set their eyes, we would say, lintoth ba'aretz, to spread out or to stretch out, or possibly to, this is nata. We saw the imperative of this earlier up here when it said hot, stretch out your ear. That's from nata. This is the infinitive of that. So stretch out, spread out, possibly even like unroll or lay down on the ground and unfold. It's the word used for like how you put a tent up. You stretch it out and then you put the poles and then, to stretch out ba'aretz. Ba'aretz can either be translated ba'aretz, on the ground or on the earth, or in. Ba can be on or in. So on the ground or on the land, on the earth, or in the land, in the earth. So translators are kind of juggling a lot of things in verse 11 here. And you can see that when you compare them. LEB, now they surround us at our every step. They intend to pin me to the ground. So they're taking to spread out in the land as like to pin, like drive the stakes down as you're putting the tent up. They're saying that that's the image of what they're trying to do to the psalmist, to pin me to the ground. NIV, they have tracked me down. They now surround me with eyes alert to throw me to the ground. The King James, they have now encompassed us in our steps. They have set their eyes bowing down to the earth. JPS, at our every step, they have now encompassed us. They set their eyes to cast us down to the earth. Tanakh, now they hem in our feet on every side. They set their eyes roaming over the land. So roaming, they would probably get this from the stretching out or spreading out meaning of nata. ESV, they have now surrounded our steps. They set their eyes to cast us to the ground. So the translators are trying to figure out, why does the Masoretic text start with our footsteps or our steps? And why did the Septuagint render that with something about casting out? To me, I think that the Hebrew ashereni, I don't see how to make much of that. And because the Greek renders this with one's casting out, I just think this is in question. There's just a big question mark about how we translate this and what the original text actually was saying. This could be textual corruption at this point, because our footsteps now surround us. If you take the Masoretic notes, our footsteps now surround us. I mean, maybe you could say like these people who the psalmist is seeking refuge from are close at his footsteps, or like they're on, like you could possibly say they're on our tracks. Like that might be a way of bringing it in English. Like they are following us. They are walking in our tracks. They are tracking us down. And that would fit with the predatory image of the next line. So that's possible. The Septuagint's the ones casting me out, or the ones seeking to throw me down, or the ones seeking my downfall, you might say. Maybe that's who's being talked about. But regardless, now they surround the psalmist. And then I think that you can actually just take the Hebrew of the second line, not as having to do with anybody being thrown down to the ground, but with the predatory imagery of these who people are seeking refuge from. They set their eyes to stretch out in the land. Like this is what these predatory oppressors are after. They have their eye to spread out in the land, or to stretch out in the land, or their eye looks out over everything that they're going to take. I think that makes as good a sense as any. And so in the land is how I would render ba'aretz rather than they want to throw me onto the ground. But either way, doesn't matter because the imagery still carries over. Verse 12, dimyono, his likeness, k'aryeh, like a lion. Yiksof litroth, nice little rhyme there. He desires to tear, just like a lion tears into its prey or tears its prey apart. So regardless of how you translate 11, 12 makes it clear this is predatory image. This is like a lion who desires to tear. V'kikfir, like a young lion, yoshev bim sathrim, literally sitting or dwelling in secret places, hiding, ready to pounce. The psalmist is praying like someone who's being stalked by a hungry lion. And so therefore, what does he want God to do? Kuma Adonai, arise, Yahweh. Kadma Panai, literally come in front of his face. Like put yourself, oppose him, we might say, face to face. Hakriehu, make him bow down. Get in front of my enemy. Come between me and this lion stalking me down. Make him bow down. Palta nafshi, save, rescue my nefesh, my soul, my life, merasha, from the wicked. And then there's just this word here, literally your sword. But remembering that this is poetry, I think helps us when we get stuck on, wait, how does this grammatically make sense? Save my life from the wicked, your sword. Well, song lyrics don't have to grammatically flow. And so that's why I've translated it this way, literally, save my life from the wicked, your sword, because that would fit with the next verse, as it's commonly translated, from men, your hand, Yahweh. So just as there's no preposition before your sword, there's no preposition before yadka, your hand. And so in parallelism, it would be save my life from the wicked with your sword. From men, parentheses, with your hand, Yahweh. From men, from the world. Or you might say from men of this world, or from worldly men. Helkam b'chaim, their portion in life, usfuncha, but your hidden or your treasured ones, timle bitnam, you will fill their belly. Yishva'u banim, sons will be satisfied. V'hinichu yithram, and they will deposit, or they will cause to rest, literally, they will leave behind, or they will put the remainder, the excess, le'olechem, to their children. Now, you can see there's some brackets in here and some alternate readings because the Hebrew of verse 14, the text of verse 14, is just unclear. I mean, in his commentary, Charles Spurgeon says, verse 14, almost every word of this verse has furnished matter for discussion to scholars, for it is very obscure. And he's right. From men. This is not the standard word for men. Memtheme. This is a very obscure word. And so a number of scholars have suggested that this is actually a scribal error, and it shouldn't be memtheme. It should be memetheme in both of these lines. And memetheme would be something like from those who kill, from the verb mot or muth or maveth, which means to put to death or to kill. So it would be saying not from men, but from one's killing, from killers, from murderers. That's what the psalmist is seeking God's protection from. And even in the Septuagint, there's a difference in Septuagint versions. So some Septuagint manuscripts say, starting with your sword, which is back up at the end of verse 13, save my life from the wicked, your sword, picking up from there. The Septuagint says, from enemies of your hand. And then the next line, Kyrie, that's Lord. That's how Septuagint often translates the divine name, Yahweh. Some Septuagint manuscripts have apoluon, which is sending away or divorcing, or we might say dismissing. And other Septuagint manuscripts, they don't say apoluon, they say apaoligon, which is from few, from earth. So from enemies of your hand, Lord, dismissing from earth, or Lord, from few from earth. Either way, that's hard to make sense in English. Divide them in their life, and what has been hidden of you was filled their belly. And then this next line is wild in different Septuagint manuscripts. One manuscript says, being gorged, and then Some manuscripts have huion, and some manuscripts have huion. Huion is pigs, and huion is sons. So the Septuagint either reads being gorged like pigs or being filled like with food, sons. And the second one makes much more sense of the Hebrew, at least, of sons will be satiated, will be filled, will be satisfied. And then the last line, and they left the remainder to their babies. And they use the word for infant or baby, nepion. So this whole verse, whether you're reading it in Hebrew, Greek, or English, it's a tricky verse. I mean, this video would be a whole other hour if we read through all of the translations of Psalm 17:14 in all of the different versions. So we're not going to do that. I'm just going to say this is what makes sense to me. My best guess as a non-linguistic expert, this is the translation I currently hold with very loose hands. Something like, backing up in verse 13, save my life from the wicked, your sword. From men or possibly from those who kill. I think that that's a very plausible explanation for this weird word. But either way, from men, meaning the men who are seeking to kill me, save me with your hand, Yahweh, from men, from the world, or from worldly men. Back up earlier in the psalm where it talked about the deeds of Adam, the deeds of humanity. I think this is maybe a callback to that, but saying it in a different way, using this more obscure word, cheled, instead of Adam. Because for men like that, their portion is in their life, like their inheritance. This Helkam, their inheritance, their allotment, what they're going to end up with, all they're going to get is in life, like the gorging and the arrogant speaking and the riches and the treasures and the acclaim and all of the stuff that these men that I'm seeking deliverance from, all of it they're banking on is in this life. But your treasured ones or your hidden ones, Yahweh, those who you do guard, like the pupil of your eye, those who do find shelter under the shadow of your wings, those who are your covenant people, who you rescued with a strong right arm, your people, God, the ones who are not the haves in this world. Frequently, they're the have-nots. Unlike those worldly men who gorge themselves and close their fat, your covenant people, Lord, you will fill their belly. Sons will be satisfied, like you'll give them enough so that even their sons will be satisfied, and they'll even have some left over to give to their children. That's my best guess at what verse 14 is saying. And then verse 15, the psalm ends where it began. Ani b'tzedek, there's the word that the psalm started with, in righteousness, literally, but we would say in vindication, or by the vindication that I've been praying for, God, that you are going to deliver or that you have delivered. Echazeh panecha, I will gaze upon your face, or I will behold your face. I will look upon your face. This is the tzedek that the psalmist is really wanting. This is what he's praying for. The ultimate answer to everything is the face of God. It's what Revelation posits at the end of all things. Being in the presence of God is what will have more value than all of the things of this life. And the last line is fascinating. Esva'ah b'chakitz tamunatecha. I will be satisfied in waking, or when I awake, your tamuna, your literally your image, your form. So some scholars have said, this is a kind of prayer that you would pray when you'd go to the temple to seek a judgment, and you would literally spend the night outside the temple waiting in the morning for the verdict. And when you awoke, you would get your vindication, your judgment from the priest, from the temple. Maybe that's possible. Others have said, no, this is a nighttime prayer. And then this last line is basically saying, when I wake up, I'll be satisfied by your form, by your presence. And maybe that's possible. Maybe this is euphemistic of like a new day dawning or something like that. But a few others have said, I think there might be something even more to this, that the psalmist may have been thinking of, yes, when I wake up in the morning, I'll be satisfied by your form. But it's an odd phrase, unless this waking isn't talking about waking from sleep, but it's talking about waking from the sleep of death. In other words, on the other side of death, I'll see your form, and that's what will satisfy me. And so this could be a foretaste or a foreshadowing of what this side of the New Testament would refer to as resurrection. And Michael Wilcock, in his commentary in the Bible Speaks Today series, actually touches on this. And he says, is he a prophet expressing in verse 15 a very New Testament doctrine of life after death? The answer is surely the same as that of Psalm 16. Held in the bond of the Lord's steadfast love, the NRSV's regular term for the very special love expressed in his unbreakable covenant. That's what chesed is. And he does take David as the author. David knew that the nightmare of persecution would end, and that God's presence with him in the future would be as real and as sure as it had been in the past. And if he should ask himself whether this would hold good even when life itself came to an end, the spirit of prophecy that was in him, for he was a prophet, must at the very least have retorted, and why not? I love this way of handling the text. He's not saying this is a proof text for the doctrine of resurrection in the Old Testament. What he is saying is the Holy Spirit who inspired whoever wrote this psalm, whether it was David, whether it was an inspired author writing in honor of David, whatever, the human author may have just been thinking of a poetic way to talk about waking up to vindication and to a new experience of God's presence. But if somebody looking back through the lens of the New Testament and the resurrection and the prophet's image of the new creation and the vision of Revelation, all of that, if looking back, you were to ask the spirit that inspired this, hey, is this also pointing towards this idea of resurrection? Why not? Surely God's chesed doesn't end with death. Surely the Sadducees were wrong, and Jesus corrected them by saying, God's not the God of the dead, but the living. He says, I am the God of your father, of Abraham, Isaac, of Jacob, the God of David, the God of Moses, the God of all of those people who have slept the sleep of death and who are waiting for that day when the dead will be raised, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting contempt, in the words of Daniel. So while the New Testament never uses Psalm 17:15 as a proof text, it doesn't really even, to my knowledge, quote or allude to this passage. Reading this psalm through gospel eyes, I can't help but see hints and shadows, a foretaste, preview of coming attractions at the end of Psalm 17. So this episode has been longer than some of our previous episodes, and a lot of it has to do with the difficulty in this psalm, the translation. It's when you get into certain passages and translation itself becomes muddy, you have to really sit down and dig and sift and work through what all the meanings of each choice you're making would entail if you translate it this way. And it can get, I spent a lot of time before even making this video, I spent a lot of time on these passages and with this Hebrew and looking at the Greek and trying to figure out and looking at this commentator and this translation and the notes in this Bible. And it's a lot of work. Does it mean you have to do all of that to get the message of this psalm? No. Any of the modern translations you use, you're going to basically get the gist of this psalm. But like with anything in scripture, the more you dig, the more treasure you find. Like all scripture, it's inexhaustible. And so hopefully this video helped bring some of that out. But that's all for now. We got to wrap it up. If you appreciate teaching like this, the best way you can show that is by subscribing to this channel, enabling notifications, and then liking and sharing our videos with other people, letting folks know about Disciple Dojo and this long-form teaching ministry that we really want to make the focus of this channel. So thank you to all of you who have done so, and stay tuned for our next video where we look at Psalm 18. And in the meantime, as always, keep training.